Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful Monday. Today I thought I would show you a cool little bioactive terrarium that I made. Now I put this together a couple months ago when I made my other one, although I improved upon some of the mistakes I made in my first build. But I got this terrarium pretty cheap from a coworker, and I thought I would turn it into a little bioactive terrarium, and I did something kind of cool with it. So I thought I would share it with you today. I had a lot of fun building my last bioactive terrarium for my mourning geckos, so I decided to make this one as well. And so this is a little bit smaller. This is a 12 by 12 by 18. The last one was a 18 by 18 by 24. So we're going to do basically the same setup as last time, but I did something a little bit different with the inside instead of using the big sticks like I did in my last one. So again, I started off with a drainage layer, and for this I am using Pangea Aqua balls. I did about 1 inch in the front, I would say, and about 1.5 inches in the back. I had these left over from my first terrarium build. So again, this is a drainage layer where any excess water will be held. Instead of sitting in your substrate layer, it'll go down and sit in here and will hopefully not cause any mold issues. So I got those put in, and I had them a little bit sloped up towards the back, again like 1 inch to 1.5 inches or so. And then after this, I added the mesh to keep the substrate out of the drainage layer. So for this, I used, again, a Pangea pre-bought, pre-cut one. I do have the window screen here, and you can do that if you're setting up your own. But it's cheap to get one pre-cut, perfectly square for the size terrarium that you want. I think it's like $3 or $4. So it's not too expensive. So I put that in here to keep the drainage and substrate layers separated. So it took me a little while to get that kind of positioned in the terrarium how I wanted to have a little bit of overlap on all the corners. And again, I forgot to mention as well that I'm using the background that came with the terrarium. I didn't make my own. Some people had commented on my last video about how any sort of feeder insects will chew through that, and I'm aware of that as well. Although so far, it's been a couple months since my 18 by 18 by 24 has been set up. I haven't noticed any huge issues with the background yet, so maybe that's something that'll come with time if I have any issues with that. But if I'm doing any more bioactives, I think I'm going to try and make my own background. So after I got my mesh into position where I wanted it, I did the right thing this time, and I moistened my ABG substrate, which is a pre-mixture of a bunch of different substrates, which is something you can also get online. And this is one of the recommended substrates that you can use for bioactive, so I put that in there as well. And in my first terrarium build, I made the mistake of putting it in dry, and then it was really hard to get it all moistened up properly after it was in the terrarium. So I made sure to moisten it before I put it in, and then I'll moisten it again after it's in there, just to keep it all kind of moist and ready to go, which is something that really helped, I feel like, set this up properly this time around. So I just put a good helping of this in there. Again, probably, I'd say 2 to 3 inches of this in there. You can see that I'm using a Zilla terrarium, so you can kind of get a good view of all the layers in there. But I put a little bit more in the back and a little bit less in the front, and I kind of just spread that out in there as well. Once I got that all situated where I wanted it, the next step was to kind of plan out what decorations I was going to put in here. And I wanted to do something a little bit different than my first one. I didn't want to use the same kind of sticks that I did, so before I put any of this stuff into the terrarium, I kind of had a plan in place. So this was my kind of plan that I had in my head. In the end, it actually didn't turn out like that, but I still think it turned out pretty good. But this is what I was initially thinking. And so a lot of the videos I had watched online when I first made this said, of course, it's smart to plan out ahead of time what you want to do. And so this was kind of my thought. Try and use some of the cork bark to make like all these different tubes and tunnels coming in at a bunch of different directions. I didn't have in mind what I was going to put in this tank yet. I was assuming more mourning geckos because I really liked the first ones that I had, but that's what I was planning for, is more mourning geckos. I also forgot to mention that when I set this tank up initially, I tried to gecko proof it before building the terrarium. I did that at the end of my last one for the mourning geckos, so that meant on this one trying to secure all the small cracks and things. Around the lid was actually pretty good on this size, but around the background I had some cracks that they could probably get into, so I glued some moss pretty tightly in there. I packed it, you might see it later, around the top of the terrarium to hopefully prevent them from getting in or behind the background. if I'm putting mourning geckos in this size terrarium. Now there was something I wanted to try. I didn't know how it was going to work out or if it would work out at all. But what I wanted to try and do, I had the idea to try and plant one of the plants I had inside of one of the cork bark tubes. And so for this terrarium, I had some leftover pothos, which I know are pretty easy to grow. So what I wanted to do is figure out a way I could plant one inside of the cork bark tube. So what I ended up doing is I took some screen and I cut it to fit the end of a big, large cork bark round, and I hot glued it on the end. Now the hot glue might or might not stick after a while, which is okay. I just needed it to stick for long enough for me to get it in place and kind of let the things settle in the terrarium. So you can see I glued it on there with some black hot glue to keep this end closed, and this is going to be in the ground anyway, so you won't see it. So it didn't really matter what it looked like, but that's what it looked like with the glue on there. And then what I wanted to do is, instead of filling it solid full of dirt, I figured it would probably be smart to put a little bit of the drainage aqua balls in there, so I wanted it to be capped off so they didn't roll out into the substrate. So that's why I capped it off, so that they can hopefully stay in there for a little while until things settle. And I figure the plant roots can grow through the screen and through the aqua balls anyway. So then after that, I cut another circular screen, which I'll put on top of the aqua balls once they're in the tube, so that I can put substrate on top of them, if that makes sense. So that's why I have this second piece of mesh cut here to fit inside of the tube there. Once I got all that figured out, it was time to go back to the terrarium and kind of start placing things in here. I still kind of wanted to keep the same vibe as from my test one, with all the different rounds stacked up all over the place. And so I didn't know how I could position the tube with the plant in it, but also get those tubes to be stacked in here, because the plant I wanted to be kind of the focal point and look like it's growing out of the tube. So I was just kind of experimenting with some different positionings here. But also this terrarium, even though it's a 12 by 12 by 18, is relatively small, so you're kind of limited in space in here. You can see how big this cork round is compared to the terrarium that I was using, and I didn't want the plant to be super close to the light and block everything out either. So it was a little bit hard to try and figure out how I could position the stuff in there the way I wanted it, along with getting the plant and tube in there as well. So what I decided to do is I had this other big piece of cork bark that just barely fit kind of corner to corner in there, and it's also cool because it has a nice little crack in the top, so if I missed in there, or any geckos want to come out through the middle, they can. They don't need to go in either end. And so I wanted to kind of get that in there as well. So I ended up placing that kind of at an angle in the tank with the crack side up, so they can get out both sides, and they can also get out through that, especially mourning geckos. I mean, they're pretty small, and so that fit in there pretty well. And I kind of just put that into the substrate a little bit to kind of hold it in there. As it turned out, that was also a perfect idea, because then my tube that I was going to put the plant in could rest right on that, and I didn't have to worry about it tipping over, because I had the one cork bark going from edge to edge, so it was pretty well stuck in there, and then this one would be kind of heavy with the plant. So what I did is I started by leaning it up against the log, and then I started putting in my aqua balls again in the bottom. Now, I couldn't tell you exactly how much I put in there. I didn't want it to be too high, because I still wanted there to be ABG substrate in there for the plant to grow in. So I'm guessing I put in around 1 inch of aqua balls, maybe a little bit more, just to give it a little bit of aeration in there. And the reason I did that is because I didn't want all the dirt in the tube or in the cork bark round to slide down eventually over time. And I also thought it would be a good idea to probably have a little bit of aeration in there, a little space in there where it's not so compacted and tight. Because I didn't want to have any issues with moisture and things. So that's why I did this. I don't know if it actually helped at the time, and I didn't know really if this has been done before, but you'll see later in the video that it actually worked out pretty good so far. And so that's what I did. And so I was just filling it with these drainage balls that I had left over from my other build and from putting in the bottom of this terrarium. Figured it wouldn't hurt at the least. Finally, I got it filled to where I wanted, and then I put the screen on there to keep the substrate out of that layer. And then next it's time to add the pothos. What I did was I took a paper towel, and like I'd mentioned, there was that big crack in the other piece of cork bark, and so I didn't want a bunch of substrate falling in there while I was trying to get this plant into the other round. So I covered it with a piece of paper towel to hopefully deflect some of that, so it wasn't filled with substrate. And I kind of just took it and put it in there. This pothos was pretty large, a little bit larger than I had expected. And so getting all the roots in there was a little bit of a challenge, but I wanted them to be nice and far down in that cork bark round. So I finally got all the roots in there and I got the substrate in there, and you can see it looks a little bit wilted, and obviously it's not used to the light at this point, so it's not really growing up straight, and it just looks a little sad in there right now. But after that, once I got that situated, it was time to add some other cork bark rounds that I had gotten and not used in my first build. And so I was trying to keep the same thing like I had showed before with my plan, to kind of have them stacked all up. I couldn't do it exactly like my initial plan because of the plant, obviously, but I was still able to get a good amount of cork bark rounds in here. And just from watching my other terrarium and the Mourning Geckos, they seem to like them, so I figured I'd probably do another Mourning Gecko build in here, a little bit smaller, but they really like the rounds to climb in and hide in and all that kind of stuff. So you can see here I got the plants in there, and I got the moss and the leaves in there, and I put another little clipping down in the bottom. I didn't know if it would live or not at the time. And then I put the rest of the cork bark in, like you can kind of see here. So I got the other little tubes in there. I did experiment with some Mopani wood, but I decided to take it out of there. It just kind of looked funny. So this is what it looked like when I had finished it a couple months ago, and now let's take a look at what it looks like today. So you can see a couple months later, this tank looks really good, so much better than it did before. The plant is, growing towards the light, so it looks more normal. It's not all wilted over, and it's actually grown quite a bit too. You can see it's shooting off some tendrils, and the one that I placed down in the bottom, which I didn't know if it would, live or not, is starting to get more leaves, so that's doing good. And I think this tank just looks really good overall. I also have a similar LED strip on it, like I did my 18 by 18 by 24, and that seems to be doing well for this plant. Now I still don't have any geckos in this tank, just because by the time it got set up and I was ready to put things in there, it was getting too cold to get some Mourning Geckos in. But I think a little bit later in spring, that's probably what I will add to this tank. I did add some springtails. I did not add any isopods at the time of setting this up, so they're in there as well. They've been kind of growing, and I've been giving them a little bit of food every now and then to keep them going in there. But I'll probably add some Mourning Geckos to this tank in the spring. I think it looks really good, and I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I've had such a great time building all these bioactive terrariums. I have space for a few more, another small one, and then probably another 18 by 18 by 24. I don't think I'll do Mourning Geckos in that big one, but that's for future things. But thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully it was pretty cool. Let me know down below. Do you like building bioactive terrariums? Do you have any? It's been a very enjoyable experience for me so far. And with that being said, I hope to see you in my next video.